So let me just begin. So let me just begin my talk by showing you this slide here. As you can see on the left, you have Milton Friedman, a very famous free market economist, and on the right, you have F.A. Hayek, who's also a very famous free market economist. And both gentlemen have really, made a strong impact in policy discourse in the UK and in the US. So they were Nobel laureates in economics. They were highly influential in the late 20th century in the Western world. They championed free market economics. Many critics today portray them as architects of neoliberalism. Okay, so this is actually the intellectual context that I'm actually referring to at this in this talk. So in this popular book that was published recently, the author writes, since the 1980s and the rise of neoliberalism, an outlook characterized by an almost religious faith in markets and an overriding focus on economic growth, our political discourse has become increasingly narrow and technocratic. Another quote by the same author, over the past few decades, our political discourse has been dominated by harsh and individualistic neoliberalism, combining a single-minded focus on economic efficiency and growth with an almost religious faith in the benefits of free markets. This other book, perhaps this is the one that may be more familiar to you. Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz has recently published this book called The Road to Freedom. And according to him, neoliberalism, of which Milton Friedman and Hayek were architects, rests on the belief in unregulated and unfettered markets. And he says that this view of freedom is a very bad one because it's freedom for the wolves, where regulations are being stripped away and allows the strong to exploit the weak. And according to Joseph Stiglitz, the rise of neoliberalism in the United States actually is responsible for increasing inequality, and increasing inequality sowed the seeds for populism, and therefore you have fascism in the form of Donald Trump. Not according to me, according to Joseph Stiglitz. All right. Now, the term neoliberalism is actually pretty hard to define because people use it in many different ways, whether they are economists or political scientists or historians. But there are some common elements here in the discourse that I just want to point out. So there is this idea of market fundamentalism, right? The idea that free markets are to be prized above all else. And this could be domestic. It could be done in domestic policy. Sometimes this also refers to what we call the Washington Consensus, a set of policies including privatization, liberalization, and deregulation that were ostensibly implemented and pressured onto developing nations by global organizations like the World Bank in the 1980s and 1990s, over and on developing countries. And some critics of neoliberalism also refer to this doctrine as one of basically mainstream neoclassical economics, resting on the conception of the Homo economicus, okay, where the individual is a rational utility maximizer. So this is, the assumption that you will work with in most classes in mainstream economics, right? It rests on the model of the rational agent. And you have, markets being highly efficient, right? And the economy, experiencing growth, right? We are trying to maximize growth and welfare. There is also the criticism that neoliberalism is anti-democratic, right? The idea that we are forcing capitalism onto unwilling nations, and we see so-called rise of authoritarian figures in the right wing, in many Western nations. So in a sense, because you have this extreme form of free markets, democracy is being undermined. Okay. So in this presentation today, I want to, respond and deal with some of these criticisms and to present an alternative view of what I believe liberalism to be. So this is Bernie Sanders. I think all of you will be very familiar with him or definitely know him. From the left wing, there is a strong criticism of neoliberalism. Okay, I read this quote here. It's a simple, straightforward reality. According to Sanders, the uber capitalist economic system that has taken home the US, propelled by uncontrollable greed and contempt of human decency, is not merely unjust, it is immoral, and we need to confront the immorality. Okay, so I think this is a very clear expression of the dissatisfaction with neoliberalism. And usually, people on the left are skeptical of the power of large corporations, the inequality that's generated, the role of money in politics, environmental degradation stemming from capitalism, all of which supposedly, is laid on the feet of market fundamentalism. Okay, remember the book by Joseph Stiglitz. Now, but the criticism of neoliberalism, let me point out very clearly, does not simply stem from the left. Today, I am not defending left or right. I'm not defending right. Okay. This is your new vice president. Okay. JD Vance. People on the right have also criticized neoliberalism. Okay. But for slightly different reasons. So this is Tucker Carlson, and he wrote, Biden embraced neoliberalism and reminded us that it's horrible. So even Biden is being accused of being a neoliberal. How's that? Right? And JD Vance writes, this is a really interesting excerpt from an article, a long article that he wrote, that he published. You can actually check it out. He writes, I do not think that America's greatest and most powerful economy was built by socialism, but I also do not believe it was built by what folks often call neoliberalism. Right? By that, I believe he means some free market open economy. I believe America's wealth was built by an American system, by a recognition that we needed to build our own industries, emphasis our own, which means American made, homemade, domestic, protect our own technology and industries. All right. So the American Compass, which is a American publication in your country, writes, neoliberalism is responsible for social atomization. People are now being more disconnected from their friends and their family and their neighbors, and this has made people more dependent on the state, and that's a bad thing. Okay. Not all, but some people on the right, especially those who are a little bit further out, they are against international institutions. They're against free trade and migration, right? You hear Donald Trump and supporters of Trump saying that we want to place tariffs, we want to engage in protectionism, right? And some of them criticize what we call atomistic individualism, the idea that extreme free markets is atomizing and can cause the family, society, and our social capital to be breaking down. So this criticism of neoliberalism exists on both the left and the right. Okay? Now, there are two problems with these criticisms. Okay? The first thing I just want to say is that government is actually growing. The size of government is actually growing in Western developed nations. Okay? So just looking at basic statistics and data actually challenges many of these criticisms. Okay? I'm just going to show you some of these things. So while it is true indeed, right, there are certain periods of time, in the 80s and 90s in some industries and countries where market-based policies have arisen, it has coexisted with the growth in state intervention and also rent-seeking by corporations as well. Rise of powerful corporations engaging in rent-seeking and lobbying of the government, right? So I think a more accurate description is that we have a mixed economy, right? A mixed economy in which the state controls many areas. Of course, corporations are influential, and in certain industries, you see the entanglement of political and economic power between business and the state, right? And you see this trend in the US, in many different Western nations. So a more accurate description of the present state of affairs is that we live in a mixed economy. I don't think it's accurate to say we live in a neoliberal paradise where there is market fundamentalism, all right? And it fails to consider some basic data. Let's look at government spending, tax burden, and regulations, all right? So here's a chart here on government spending as a share of GDP from 1990 to 2021. Okay, so I put the UK where I'm from and the US where you are from. And you see in the so-called period of neoliberalism, which is basically the 90s and the 10, 20 years after that, you see actually, government spending as a share has been relatively constant. And in fact, you can say there is a slight increase, right? So obviously you see there's a sharp increase on the right during the COVID period, which I think is natural. But you don't see that there is some dramatic fall, as you would expect if the narrative of neoliberalism is to be accepted. Okay, so this is one. And the next thing you see, so this is the EU, which is where I'm located. Annual total government expenditure in EU from this period of time, the so-called age of neoliberalism, it has increased in absolute terms, right? It has not actually gone down. And if you talk about as a share of GDP in the EU over this period of time by function, you can see it's relatively constant. There isn't some dramatic fall in terms of government expansion, which would suggest market fundamentalism, the sort of discourse that Joseph Stiglitz is championing, right? And in the United Kingdom, this is, I don't think maybe true for you guys, but in the UK, we are experiencing, the highest level of taxes since the 60s, right? So where is this neoliberalism, that Joseph Stiglitz is talking about? Pray tell me. Um, tax burdens, right, in other European nations, G7, EU14 is actually steadily on the rise. It's going up over the past several decades. So, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, where is neoliberalism? Please tell me. I want to find it. And this is back to the United States. Number of pages published in the Code of Federal Regulations. I found this chart, which looks really good, and I'm showing this to all of you. Where's the neoliberalism? If we are stripping away the rules and have freedom for the world, certainly you would see a reverse trend. Not exactly what is shown on the screen. So just looking at some of this basic data without even providing any theory, I mean, you can see some of the discourse starts to fall flat. Okay. And the second problem now with the narrative is actually globally on a global level, okay, when we don't just focus on the Western nations, on a global level, you see markets have actually spread wealth and prosperity. The idea that we are living more miserable lives with greater levels of inequality is not totally borne out by the evidence. Okay. So when one considers a longer time frame and global perspective, the rise of market exchange and globalization has made the world richer and more equal. Okay, let me show you some evidence for what I'm saying. Now, I want to qualify my statement here. Inequality statistics have indeed risen within specific countries, but global inequality across countries, especially if you look at it on an absolute level in terms of poverty rather than inequality, you see that things have actually improved. Okay, so it depends on what your focus is. Are you talking about within a country or across nations? Are you looking at poverty or are you looking at inequality, which are two different things? Poverty refers to the absolute level of wealth and incomes that people have, whether there's income mobility that allows you to have a better life over time. That's poverty alleviation. Inequality, whether income or economic, refers to a gap. There is a gap between the top 10% and bottom 10%, for example, and that's inequality, right? If we look at poverty, if we look at absolute levels of well-being, that is actually improved dramatically over the past few hundred years, right? And by the way, higher inequality doesn't tell us anything about income mobility, right? You can have a society with a gap, right? But that doesn't tell me anything about whether or not there is mobility, which means that people at the bottom 10% and the bottom 5% are experiencing higher incomes over their lifespan over 5, 10, 15 years. Okay? So it's not about inequality, it's about the mobility, right? But of course, if there are barriers that prevents income mobility from taking place, then obviously that is a problem which has to be solved. Okay. I would say it's better to live in an unequal but upwardly mobile society than one which is equally poor. Because you could theoretically have a case where you have high levels of equality, but you are equally poor, right? So I would put forth the thesis to you that it does not matter, how much more cars or mansions Jeff Bezos has as compared to you and I. What matters is whether there are barriers in society that are preventing you from starting a business, from earning a good income, from being productive, from being innovative, and moving up the socio-economic ladder over your life, over your career lifespan. That I think is actually more important. And we look at actually on a global level, these are 6 charts from our world in data showing how the world has actually improved, has gotten, much more prosperous over the last 2 centuries. Poverty has dramatically declined. Access to education and literacy has improved. On the left side of the screen, you can see vaccination, child mortality, which are healthcare indicators. This is absolute across the world over the past 2 centuries, right? And guess what? All of these trends, we witness it since the rise of modern capitalism in the 1800s. So when people talk about neoliberalism, I understand what they mean, 80s and 90s, but if you look at a longer trend, since the time of Adam Smith, the father of modern capitalism, the improvements of free trade, globalization, has led to all this great stuff that we take for granted today. And this is a very important chart here by the scholar Branko Milanovic, who shows that actually when you look at income inequality across the globe, not within specific countries, you see actually it has gone down. Okay? And he divides it into 3 phases. You have the first phase, which is the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the West, right? Western Europe, the United States had a head start in global development, right? They had improvements in technology, which then allowed them to colonize the developing world. So you see there was global inequality because there was a rise of the West, which then meant that other nations were, falling behind, right? So there was a global inequality. But this started to slow down in the late 20th century as many other countries were starting to catch up, right? So from the 50s, 1950 to 2000, he calls it the age of the three worlds, right? Where you had the rich West, you had the really, really poor nations in the global South, and you had some nations somewhere in the middle in the Eastern European bloc and in the Soviet bloc, in the USSR. And what is important is that from the year 2000 onwards, you had the rise of Asia, including millions of people in China rising out of poverty, the dramatic growth of Taiwan, Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, my country, right? We call them the Asian tigers. And the sheer size of Asia, because so many people lifted out of poverty, that made a severe dent in global income inequality. So it is true, as I said, I need to qualify myself. It is true that within specific countries, there is an increase in the gap, right? But when you look at it across the world on a global scale, global income inequality has fallen since the year 2000. Should this be credited to neoliberalism? Now, this is a very important source as well. The author Daniel Waldenstrom, feel free to check out this book. It was recently published a few months ago called Richer and More Equal, A New History of Wealth in the West. And he shows actually there's been a democratization of wealth actually, over the past, 100 years. Um, and he explains this by looking at the aggregate composition of assets, right? And he says that in the past, most of the stock of wealth in society were concentrated in large industrial corporations and also in estates. And estates refers to agricultural land, which was owned by a small group of people, could be politically connected to monarchs and kings and queens in monarchical countries, or as a throwback to the feudal era. But over time, because there's been an expansion of home ownership amongst ordinary people like you and me, more people now today own homes, and more people now have savings in pension funds. And as you know, when you have savings in pension funds, the wealth just doesn't stay there, right? It grows because it's being reinvested. So home ownership helps to distribute wealth and spread it across society, which is why home ownership is actually a very important policy. If a society is not a properly owning democracy and people cannot afford homes, then that really does exacerbate wealth inequality. But because access to home ownership across these six countries, a representative of the West, has improved, pension funds has actually grown people saving, the share of elite wealth to people's wealth has actually changed. Most wealth is spread in the hands of ordinary people, locked up in their homes and pension funds, rather than the preserve of the elites, the lands, the estates, the corporations that some own. There's been a democratization of wealth. And the reason why I really want to talk about this point is because liberalism in its classical sense, in the original sense, not what people think of as neoliberalism. Let's go back to Adam Smith, right? Who wrote the book Wealth of Nations in 1770, published in 1776, the very year that, your country achieved independence and declared independence, right? Adam Smith was an egalitarian, okay? Now, we don't usually think of him that way. We think of Adam Smith as promoting the free market invisible hand, but actually, he was really concerned about equality, not in terms of equality of outcomes, but equality in a very specific sense, because he was writing in the era of feudalism, right? Before mass capitalism was the norm. And in feudalism, some of you have watched Game of Thrones, right? Game of Thrones. And if you watch Game of Thrones, that is feudalism, right? Where you are born into a hierarchical society. And the status hierarchy in a feudal society is locked, right? And it's enshrined and entrenched into law. So if you are born into a certain class, you probably are stuck there indefinitely unless you are engaging in some sort of rent seeking and change the system in some fundamental way, right? But people are locked into status hierarchy in a feudal society. And Adam Smith believed that free markets help to liberate people from these chains. So we usually think of exploitation. Some people think of exploitation in a Marxist way, right? Exploitation is when you have workers being exploited by people who own the means of production, right? But actually, Adam Smith was also concerned by exploitation, by the way. Exploitation for Adam Smith and for liberals like myself does not come from capitalists over workers, but it comes from rent seekers over value creators, right? When you create value, when you start a business, when you sell something, when you exchange something with your neighbor, with someone in the marketplace, you are creating value. You are engaging in a win-win positive sum exchange. But there are some people in society, certain corporations, well-connected individuals who engage in what economists call rent seeking, right? Which is that you are getting a privilege or a special advantage or protection that is not available to someone else. That is exploitation because you are taking without giving. You are profiting without creating, right? And liberals like myself and Adam Smith, we believe that the rule of law is very important, right? The rule of law protects equality, and when rent seeking occurs, it subverts the rule of law, right? And people are now no longer treated equal because some people now have special privileges that they have access to that other people don't. So consider the 2008 bailouts to financial institutions in the United States and many countries. And there's also evidence that recently COVID spending, massive amounts of government spending that was done for very legitimate reasons actually, ended up in the hands of the wealthy, right? And we see numerous examples, not just in the US, but in Western Europe, of politically connected individuals and corporations, right, having a conflict of interest because they are basically in bed with the government, right? And that is something that liberals and egalitarians, like Adam Smith, would be very against, actually. So I would say that some of these capitalist injustices that we see, we could actually call it problems of neo-feudalism, right? Not neoliberalism, right? It is a throwback to the feudal era. Many of these feudal privileges sometimes come back again. So it tells you that actually sometimes those injustices that we see, it's not something that we can just totally get rid of so easily, right? So, and I just want to expand this view of liberalism and a free society um, to two thinkers that I'm highly influenced by. And I want to present this view to you called spontaneous liberalism. So forget about neoliberalism. I call this spontaneous liberalism, and I don't think that you would have heard this term anywhere. You will see on the right here two Nobel laureates. At the top, Eleanor Ostrom, the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics without a degree in economics. Okay, her degree was something else. Okay, and also F.A. Hayek. Um, Now, what is spontaneous liberalism? It is in the tradition of Adam Smith, but it is expanded by these two scholars here you see on screen. The basis of this worldview is that the world is a complex place. Okay, the world is a complex place. What do we mean by the world is a complex place? Social phenomena, okay, are multidimensional. It is difficult to plan society, to plan the economy, to predict and forecast with precision the things that will happen in 5 years, in 10 years' time, because there are so many interacting factors that can cause unintended consequences to occur at multiple levels, whether positive or negative. The world is an extremely complex place. So, spontaneous liberalism is a worldview that takes the problem and the reality of complexity very, very seriously. And if you take complexity very seriously, you would see that the rise of the modern world was never designed by a single mind. A few slides ago, when I showed you that, look, right, there is increase in wealth, reduction in poverty, which started in the West and then which spread around the world, there is no single mind or a single agent at the top who planned the rise of modern prosperity in history. There was no central planner and intelligent mind at the top that decided that the industrial revolution was going to happen in a specific time in a specific country and spread the way that it did. There were numerous contingent factors interacting with various variables across the countries that led to what we call industrial revolution, capitalism, and the rise of modern prosperity, right? So economists, some people emphasize institutions, right? Recent Nobel laureates, right? Acemoglu, Robinson, right? Some scholars emphasize it was geography. Some say it was ideas. But actually, I think a more accurate description is that it's a complex interaction of various factors, ideas, culture, geography, and institutions in certain parts of Western Europe in the 1800s, and then you had the rise of modern industrial capitalism, which spread around the world, right? And by the way, if you're interested in this, you can check out economic historian Joel Mokyr, who has written some, great books about the rise of the West from this perspective. For me, what I want to emphasize is that this theory of spontaneous liberalism is one that sees individuals. Look at the person next to you in the room around you. We are creative agents, right? Who can transform the status quo. That's what we call entrepreneurship. Okay. Now, why is this important? I'm moving somewhere in my presentation, but I just want to lay this point here. So let me focus now on F.A. Hayek, whom you see on screen here. So Hayek is a very interesting economist because he's different from, for example, Milton Friedman, right? In the very first slide, I showed you Friedman and Hayek on the same slide. Many critics of neoliberalism lump them together because they say, wow, look at these two individuals promoting market fundamentalism. But if you actually know your economic theory, you would know that actually they differ strongly in methodology. Okay, so Hayek was actually against and is against neoclassical mainstream economists, right? Um, and this means that he cannot be classified as a neoliberal. If we mean neoliberal to be a mainstream neoclassical economist who sees, the economy as just an engine to maximize growth, efficiency and wealth, because that was never Hayek's method when it comes to the social science. There are some economists who view the society this way. People from the Chicago School of Economics, for example, colleagues of Milton Friedman, people like Gary Becker. Well, certainly that's true. But Hayek questioned neoclassical economics. He questioned the methods that most mainstream economists use today. Why is that so? Let's summarize it. He says that humans are not calculators. We are not lightning fast calculators. Now, in economics, we assume that people are rational agents, right? What does that mean in simple terms? We have knowledge and information about all the choices we have before us. We're able to calculate the costs and benefits of all the choices before us, rank them accordingly, and choose the one which is most optimal, right? That is, the gist of it. Okay, it's the essence of the idea. Um, but many economists like behavioral economics, and certainly someone like Hayek would question whether humans are really rational agents of this form, right? So in a sense, you can say Hayek had some similar views to behavioral economists in that they question the rationality assumption, right, in mainstream economics. But different from behavioral economics, this limited rationality of human beings is not a problem, actually. Behavioral economists see it as a problem to be corrected by nudging. But Hayek and fellow Austrian school economists, we call them, do not see that as a problem, right? In fact, what we call bounded rationality, imperfect knowledge, is actually the whole point of engaging in markets in the first place, right? It is precisely because we are all, are ignorant about the complexity of the world around us that we need to have a way for us to discover knowledge, a way for us to engage in trial and error learning, to correct the mistakes that we make and improve our strategies, whether in a corporation or in your personal life. And that's why Hayek had a quote where he calls competition is a discovery process, right? Competition is a discovery process. Let me just describe this very easily with a sports analogy, right? Some of you may be fans of NFL teams, right? Certainly, I'm a fan of some, soccer teams, right? So, before the start of every sports season, right? Fans of sports teams make all sorts of wild predictions. My team is gonna be like top of the NFL. It's gonna be the top of the NBA or something like that, right? Um, and managers and fans and sports commentators can make all sorts of predictions that they want, right? But it is only within the course of the actual competition of the sports season, right, that you actually know for sure what strategies you are going to take, how you're going to adjust your player lineups, for example, in relation to the feedback that competition tells you. It is within the course of competing with other sports teams that you gain the necessary knowledge that you need to optimize your strategy, to navigate the sports season and to come to some sort of an efficient outcome, right? So knowledge does not exist outside of the actual process of competing against other firms, against other sports teams, as it were, using the analogy, right? So competition is very important, not because it's perfect knowledge, no, but because it facilitates trial and error learning in an arena of competition. And that's the reason why centrally planned societies, Soviet Union, North Korea, I mean, centrally planned societies in history usually fail because it runs afoul of what Hayek calls the knowledge problem. There's lots of knowledge of time and place, knowledge which is local, it is dispersed, it is decentralized. Knowledge is sometimes we cannot articulate ourselves. You know how to ride a bicycle, but you may not be able to articulate consciously a step-by-step process of how to ride a bicycle. That is something that you have to actually acquire from experience. You have to acquire from trial and error how to ride a bicycle. Lots of knowledge in the economy is like that, right? And that's why Hayek says that there's a knowledge problem and centrally planned societies fail. So this is spontaneous liberalism. It's a view of the free society that focuses on the problem of complexity and the importance of competition and trial and error learning. Okay, so what is the implication here in terms of development policy? Okay, when we think about global development and poverty in the world, many critics of neoliberalism, um, they decry what we call Washington consensus, right? They say that, in the 80s and 90s, global organizations were forcing Washington consensus policies into the developing world, into the global south. Well, I agree with them partially. Okay, that is indeed true that some economists, like maybe Jeffrey Sachs, recommended shock therapy, market transitions in developing countries. Well, that's true. It's true that, they did that. But spontaneous liberalism, in the vision of Hayek and Ostrom, was never about creating markets and achieving growth at all costs. It was never about that at all. It's about respecting people's choices in light of the fact that we do not actually know what is it that people want or what is actually best for others. If we do not actually know what's best for others, if unintended consequences are actually serious, then perhaps, right, we shouldn't be telling other nations what to do. Then perhaps we shouldn't be forcing Washington consensus in the developing world. So the Washington consensus imposition on poor nations, right, it actually reflects what we call the tyranny of experts, right, that Hayek warned about, that spontaneous liberals like me warned about. Respect choices, respect pluralism. The irony here, however, is that neoliberalism's critics do not follow their own logic seriously. They decry foreign interventionism. They say, oh, we do not want, Washington consensus, free market policy to be forced in developing countries. But they do not oppose domestic interventionism. When the state grows big, when the government starts to regulate and over-regulate the economy and in society, they do not follow their own logic to its own conclusion. That's the irony. Um, so what about the democracy issue? Okay, this is a bit tricky. Okay, so neoliberalism's critics, right, they like to say that it promotes or supports authoritarian populism in far right. So they will classify, your next president, Donald Trump, as a far right authoritarian populist. Whether that's true or not, doesn't matter to me. And some would say, for example, someone like Marine Le Pen, right, in France, to be a far-right authoritarian populist. Well, okay, if I accept this argument, then you must also be concerned about the far left, okay? Authoritarian populism and extremist uh, values and practices do not just exist on one spectrum. It exists also on the left. Okay. In fact, when you start veering out, you start becoming quite illiberal. Okay. Now, in Hayek, he and other classical liberals like Milton Friedman, they argue that market economies are necessary, but not but insufficient for political liberty. Now, this is a very important point. Differentiating between necessary and sufficient conditions. Okay? Some of you know the famous book written by Hayek called The Road to Serfdom. In that book and in classical liberal theory more generally, the argument here is as follows. If you have centrally planned economies, if the government is over-regulating the economy, then actually that's quite dangerous. Because if the state has the power to manage the economy and tell you what to buy, what not to buy, what firms are going to be producing what, in a full-fledged, we call it comprehensive central planning, then there is an absolute power concentration, which is why you do not see in history any centrally planned economies who practice full socialism, not the Bernie Sanders version, full comprehensive socialism, actually remain democratic. You do not see that. Okay? But it is true that many capitalist nations and those that experience economic liberalizations have not always become democratic. That is true, right? Because capitalism is a necessary condition, but it may not be sufficient for political liberty. The best example is China, right? China has experienced economic liberalizations, increased openness to trade, but it remains a closed shop when it comes to politics, right? So authoritarian elites in China, by the way, they learned it from Singapore, my country. Okay. They want the fruits of capitalism. They want the fruits of markets, but they want to subvert the spirit of voluntarism that animates markets, right? So that's the democracy issue. Now, I want to end the presentation by moving to a slightly different area, which is actually very important to me. Let's talk about society and not just economics. Okay. So I talked about this thing called spontaneous liberalism. Okay. Spontaneous liberalism is a view of individualism. Okay. It's an individualist view, but it's not an atomistic view. It is not an atomistic view. Okay. Spontaneous liberals like Smith, Ostrom, and Hayek believe that individuals matter. Okay. But individuals are also situated in social relationships. Okay. Adam Smith. Everyone talks about his book Wealth of Nations, but he also wrote a different book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he talked about how human beings have a capacity to follow our conscience, have a capacity for moral judgment that guides our actions and guides our ethical decisions in ways that are not just a byproduct of external regulation from the state. Human beings have a great capacity for moral sentiments. And the work of Eleanor Ostrom, right? Her Nobel laureate, Nobel Prize winning work was about how communities in different countries can govern themselves, creating rules to solve social problems. We do not have to be locked into the tragedy of the commons. And even in Hayek, right? Because we live in a complex world, institutions are important as guideposts to navigate the complex world in which we live. We must rely on rules, social institutions, and relationships to navigate the complex world. So this, a theory of the free society, as it were, spontaneous liberalism, is about how individuals matter. You are an individual, you matter, but it's not an atomistic form of individualism, right? It is not the more radical form of individualism, for example, that you may find from Ayn Rand, the philosopher Ayn Rand, for example. Okay, so Hayek calls this spontaneous order. Some of you may have heard of this term before. Social institutions, you can say the economy, is a spontaneous order, right? A spontaneous order is the result of human action, but not human design. Okay, let's use the example of language. It's the best example. Language is not designed by any one person, but it has evolved over time as different people engage in their own interpretation of what the language is supposed to be, right? So it's the result of human action in a decentralized form, but on a whole, the English language was never designed, right? It is not a product of intelligent design, it's a product of bottom-up evolution, right? Language is one example. The market is one example. The economy is one example. And as you will see in my last few slides, many other aspects of life can actually be described this way as well. Okay? Individuals are product of their environments, right? If you're born in a certain country, you speak a certain language. If your parents have some, religious influences, you'll probably be influenced by the people you hang out with, the, family upbringing, and so on and so forth. That is natural and to be expected. But what we inherit from culture, we also transform through our mutual interactions. We are a product of our environments, but we are not prisoners of it. Okay? People inherit language, yes, but in their mutual interactions, right? You form dialects, subgroups, slangs, certain informal expressions, inside jokes that you have with your friends, with your friend cliques. None of these things are centrally planned, right? Social behavior, none of this is centrally planned. It is a product of spontaneous social interactions, which then revise, the cultural environment that's around us, right? And it's important to note what I'm arguing for today transcends left and right. Okay, I'm not just defending free market as some sort of a right-wing position. Okay, in fact, people on the left, they usually prioritize social change, right? Right? Openness, right? They would be they'll be okay, LGBT, right? Alternative lifestyles, right? So people on the left, they prioritize social change and openness, but they are not so, open to economic liberty, markets, private property. While the reverse is true for the political right. But both fail. I will argue today, and this is the most important point. If you forget everything today, this is my most important point. Okay, one without the other is incomplete. One without the other is incomplete. Okay, spontaneous liberalism of Adam Smith, of Ostrom, of Hayek, which I subscribe to, which I'm trying to put forth to you, sees both as intertwined. Intertwined. Why? Let me explain this. A few slides and then we have some Q&A. When people enjoy property rights and economic liberty, they act in ways that we cannot predict, which can revise social norms. Conversely, if minorities and social groups, people who are progressives, who care about this, if these people are to be free, if these people are to have liberation from oppression, they need personal space to be themselves. And that requires property and markets. Okay, let me show you point 1, point 2, and then I'll conclude. Economic liberty revises social norms. Conservatives, people on the right, generally emphasize small government, right? We do not want the government to tell us what to do. Okay, economic liberty, markets, hard work, so on and so forth, which is great. Okay, but when people enjoy such liberties, they may use them in ways that we do not predict or foresee, right? Spontaneous liberalism. There's lots of unintended consequences in the way people use their property and their money and engage in transactions with others. Economic liberty that is used to set up Amazon, a corporation, can also be used to set up a gay or a lesbian bar, to use an example. Okay? Social norms evolve through economic liberty. Consider gender-neutral androgynous fashion trends. If you see the picture here, right? It is a spontaneous order that arises through acts of cultural entrepreneurship, right? These individuals are engaging in their own actions. They are using their property and their money as they see fit. And as they engage in these decisions in a very decentralized fashion, you see the world of fashion, you see the way people dress, you see all these social norms, it starts changing, right? When people are free to associate and free to do what they want, right? The social fabric in which we live, the cultural fabric, starts to also evolve. Okay? So if you accept economic liberty, then you will have to also, in a sense, expect that the social world, the cultural world, is an open-ended one that arises through acts of creative entrepreneurship, creative cultural entrepreneurship. Okay? Now, on the reverse, for progressives, okay, progressives, they downplay the importance of private property and markets, right? They are more concerned about social issues. They're more concerned about questions of fairness, right? When you have minorities like LGBT groups who are, deserving of greater recognition and empowerment. And I think that's great also, okay? Disadvantaged groups and lifestyles, however, will be in peril if they are subject to democratic pressure or subject to centralized political authority. In other words, right, if progressives really are concerned about minorities, they should also be against big government. Okay? Big government, okay, is not a friend of minorities, is not a friend of LGBT. Okay? I mean, let's put it in this way. High taxes, regulations, slowing economy, if you have a slowing economy, it hurts paychecks. Minorities are affected. And in fact, if you are a minority, okay, and okay, let's say you are a gay person. You are living in a family which is disapproving, which may not be very open-minded of alternative lifestyles. There's a slowing economy. Guess what? You will not have a means of personal independence. Economic growth and wealth allows minorities, right, a way to be independent from disapproving family members and a disapproving, social environment around them. Wealth is a source of empowerment. Wealth is a source of enrichment, right? And capitalism provides that. Okay. And think about LGBTQ spaces, right? This is a Stonewall Inn, right, has provided safe haven, a place of authenticity in an otherwise heteronormative world. This is a problem that, progressives care about, right? But guess what? If you want to have these personal spaces that are authentic reflections of the identities of some minority groups, then this requires economic liberty. This means that we need to oppose big government that interferes with how private property is being used in specific places, right? So, when we talk about economic liberty and social liberty, we can't, disentangle it, right? We can't disentangle both, okay? So I now conclude, okay, critics of neoliberalism fail to appreciate the long-run increases in absolute living standards under market era, and that recently government has grown in Western developed nations. They failed basic tests of some data, okay? While it is true there are some market fundamentalists or economists who are wedded to Homo economicus, there is a richer understanding of society and progress in what I have called today spontaneous liberalism that starts with Adam Smith and I think really developed, into greater extent by Ostrom and Hayek. Spontaneous liberalism transcends left and right. Okay? Spontaneous liberals, we celebrate creative human action. We call that entrepreneurship. But this entrepreneurship could be economic entrepreneurship, setting up Amazon, or it could be cultural entrepreneurship. Okay? Having an alternative lifestyle, an alternative identity. Wearing your dress, wearing your trousers in a different way, right? Championing a new fashion trend. That's cultural entrepreneurship. Whether you call it social, economic, whatever, it springs from creative human action. And when people are free to engage in creative interactions, this would unintentionally foster social change, open-endedness, prosperity, and diversity. Okay? So a free society, and this is the most important point, and with this, spontaneous liberals see a free society is one of social, ethical, and economic creative destruction, where norms, identities, categories, existing firms, the income distribution as continually subject to change and destabilization. That is what a free society is. I don't care about neoliberalism. I care about spontaneous liberalism. With that, thank you very much for your time and your attention. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chong. And book. We have some time for. Do we have some time for Q&A? I want to be cognizant of your time. So, if you guys have any questions, feel free to come up to the computer here and then ask. So, yeah. You can come here. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, thank you for presenting to us on a Friday night. The breadth of your presentation and depth of your arguments was much appreciated, honestly. I love that you pointed out the outsized voice the wealthy have in Washington.
Yeah.
It seems to me the U.S. is sliding towards oligarchy or something looking like that. It seems to be a really difficult problem to solve for a number of reasons. But what are your suggestions for either removing or slowing the inflow of money into campaigns? As we saw in the recent U.S. elections, the most campaign contributions we've had, and even in like a very short period of time, So how do we curtail the rent seeking and by extension, what you refer to as neo-feudalism? Like, how do we slow that down?
So that's a great question. It's a very complex one. If I had the answer, probably I would be very rich by now. Now, the interesting thing is this, okay? As a classical liberal, as a spontaneous liberal, and progressives, actually, someone like Joseph Stiglitz, whom I mentioned just now, I think we share a similar diagnosis that there is this problem of what we call crony capitalism, of the entanglement of political and economic elites. So actually, the diagnosis is there. But the solution actually is different. Someone like Joseph Stiglitz would say that the solution is actually more regulation. For example, having campaign finance laws, okay, having more restrictions or maybe term limits of politicians. So you don't have career politicians who are there, who have like strong relationship with lobbyists. Greater scrutiny and monitoring over the sort of things that corporations do to influence the political process. Regulations that prevent someone like Elon Musk, right, to somehow, who has like millions of dollars of contract, but at the same time now it's like a government secretary. You know what I mean? So people who are progressives have that sort of solution. I don't think that's totally wrong, but I don't think that goes to the root of the problem. So what I'd like to say is this: if we want to get money out of politics, I think we should first get politics out of money, right? Um, and that's why, I subscribe to public choice economics, which says that actually when you start politicizing a lot of economic decisions, when you, for example, the FDA, right, and these administrative state agencies are making such powerful decisions of regulations or subsidies, then that creates an attractive target of opportunity for firms and lobbyists and special interest groups to try to capture it and go against it, right? In my country of Singapore, this is not so much of a problem, but I used to be a civil servant, so right, so I know some of these problems. I used to engage in industrial policy where subsidies are given out very generously, to small firms, for them to apply for these grants, right? And the incentive of these firms is really to engage in rent seeking. They want to make friends with me, they want to influence it so they can get ever larger shares of it. I don't think there is a very simple solution. I would say various solutions are necessary, but all I want to say is that it's not just a matter of having more regulations. Sometimes it's actually having less, having general rules and make sure government policies are not always favoring one group over the other. That would generally reduce the incentive, I would think, for firms and crony capitalists to try to capture the political process. It's not a perfect solution, but I think public choice economists have lots to tell us and teach us on that.
Thank you once again. I appreciate your time.
Hello. So you mentioned more freedom for economics.
Yeah.
And I'm curious as to your thoughts about the argument for a more socialistic government, which can be seen more in Europe versus rather than here in the US.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on giving up more? Because a lot of those programs over in Europe offer a more well-structured social welfare program. So if you have a mother with multiple children who is getting well-structured assistance from the government, is it worth it in her case to have a more economic freedom if she's giving up those other things that's
Okay,
provided by law?
that is a fantastic question. It's a great one. So let me just say a few things. Number one, I would not call these European countries socialist. Okay, so the word socialist is a very specific word that we need to use, right? So Bernie Sanders, he likes to throw it around. So by socialism, we should mean government ownership of the means of production and abolition of market prices, which most people in the European countries do not actually advocate. So I would consider those a specific variety of capitalism. It's still capitalism, but I think what you're referring to is greater levels of redistribution, more generous welfare provisions, like a welfare state form of capitalism. Okay. And you described it in a very positive way. I'm not sure I'm as actually sanguine as you are, because I'm actually living under one of those nations right now, the United Kingdom, where we have what we call the National Health Service. Okay. The National Health Service is a case where it's free at the point of use. Okay. So if I have a cold tomorrow and I go to the GP, all of the GP, the medical clinics are all government run. Okay, this is really what you call a centrally planned health system. Okay, you think yours is bad. This is worse. Okay, I can never see the GP. Okay, I can never, it's free. Yeah, it's free, but I can never access this free resource. Okay. So when the government is overly involved in some of these welfare provisions, it can be very, very inefficient. Okay. So that's one thing I want to say. But however, I acknowledge that it is important for any society, even free societies, to have a robust social safety net. Okay, so I do not deny that. The question is that how do we design a robust social safety net in a way that is not bloated, that is not overly bureaucratic, and is not inefficient? That is the trick. Okay, now, generally what I favor would be approaches that are general, that reduce the need for bureaucracies and government politicians, right, to decide who deserves what. Okay, so I would favor, for example, something like a universal basic income or a negative income tax, where it is generally applicable to everyone, regardless of your income level, regardless of your background, right? And that actually cuts out a lot of the middlemen, where you have government bureaucracies deciding, who deserves what, how much you need, how much you do not need, right? So I think there's a robust social safety net that has to be in place. But I would want to favor something that is more general. It's quite a radical vision, I acknowledge, rather than existing welfare states, which may not always be very efficient. And also, you mentioned Scandinavian countries, right? And even the United Kingdom, it's funded by high taxes, by the way. Okay. And are high taxes, a good thing? Why is it that in your country you have all the top corporations? You have Apple, you have Amazon, you have all the mega corporations, right? In the United Kingdom, we cannot have there isn't even one such large, Forbes sort of level corporation in the EU. Why is that? The Economist magazine recently said that the American economy is the envy of the world, according to the Economist magazine, because you have much greater economic freedom. You have a much more dynamic economy, right? And that means that people have higher wages, right? They have bigger paychecks. They can take care of themselves. Now, this does not preclude a social safety net, right? But a high income to me is the best form of security, right? Which is why, by the way, I just want to tell you that I'm also even thinking of moving to the United States. Okay, so you may see me in your country soon, right? If things go well. All right, let me stop there.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions from the crowd? That might be it for the questions. So thank you very much for talking with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all of you. So feel free to email me. This is my email here. I'm happy to send you an e-copy of this book for free to anyone. I'm not trying to make money. That's not my objective. I'm happy to hear from you and interact further with you. Thank you very much once again for spending a Friday afternoon.
If these topics are interesting, so. Thank you again, and we recorded it and upload it to YouTube as well, so I'll get that link to you.